Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. In the last few years, there has been an increased focus because of the kind of the confected culture wars, which in the UK and the US and other parts of the world have been prevalent. There's been an increasing focus on historical monuments, historical statues and other sites which we associate meaning to, contested meaning very often. This is no new thing, though many of the statues that are most keenly fought over have a kind of a much shorter pedigree than people perhaps are aware of, particularly Confederate statues in America. What does it mean? What is the kind of the contested meaning of fascist memorials? These are the sorts of things that we don't imagine really exist. You know, if you live in a society that was victorious over fascism, and if our collective kind of Anglo-centric or Americano-centric worldview is that, you know, fascism was kind of eradicated, what does it mean when there are fascist shrines, in essence, as there was to Franco for many years, which is currently the site of immense debate and controversy in Spain? Well, one way of exploring this is looking at Mussolini's tomb and the way in which Mussolini is memorialised in Italy. Obviously, the physical remains of Hitler were, when they were found, the charred remains were taken to the Soviet Union and shipped around for a long time and disposed of in all sorts of mysterious circumstances, precisely to prevent there from being a shrine to Hitler. Mussolini's fate, murdered by the partisans in Italy in 1945 and strung up outside a petrol station, mean that the kind of the way in which he is remembered in Italy is slightly different. I'm reading today from Keith Lowe's brilliant book Prisoners of History, which is a study of numerous Second World War monuments, and Mussolini's tomb at Predappio in Italy is kind of an interesting, a really interesting exploration, and it helps us to understand what the historical memory of Mussolini in Italy actually is. The Christopher Duggan's brilliant book Fascist Voices, in the final chapter, talks about the long history of the rehabilitation of fascist ideas in Italy, and the amazing book Fascism by Roger Eatwell. It helps us to understand, and I've talked a lot about that book. It's a great exploration of how fascism lingered in Italy, and even through the kind of the sort of quasi-fascist ideas limped on through the populist con artist Silvio Berlusconi, who passed away the other week and no doubt will get his own shrine at some point. Okay, so Keith Lowe writes, it's 2018, it's April the 28th, 2018, and a long procession is making its way out of the village of Predappio in central Italy. There are several hundred people here, almost all of them dressed in black, as if for a funeral. They walk slowly, solemnly, along the Via della Libertà in the direction of the church of San Cassiano and its cemetery. Many wear strange black hats, sometimes a fez, sometimes a beret, sometimes even an old-fashioned military helmet adorned with black feathers. Some carry Italian flags decorated with eagles, others carry banners bearing the names of military organisations and marching bands. One holds a placard reading Lihano sparato ma non sono riusciti a ucciderlo. They shot him, but they didn't manage to kill him. Anyone unacquainted with Italy and its history would be forgiven for thinking that the participants were here to attend the burial of a recent murder victim. But in fact they were here to commemorate a man who died 73 years earlier. Benito Mussolini, the wartime dictator of fascist Italy, was born in this village and is also buried here. His body lies in the family crypt, and these people have come to honour his memory. They do this 3 times a year, on the anniversaries of his birth, his death, and the anniversary of the day he and his followers marched to Rome to seize power, October the 28th. There is something slightly spooky about the gathering. Very few people here are from the village itself, whose inhabitants generally frown upon the processions. Their black shirts are reminiscent of the uniforms worn by Mussolini's notorious fascist militia, as are some of the slogans on their banners. Onore e fedelità, honour and loyalty, for example, or Boa ci molla, death to cowards. The symbols they carry all come from a bygone era. Eagles, daggers, Celtic crosses, and everywhere the symbol of the fasces, a bundle of sticks tied together with an axe. These symbols, still taboo, are carried openly and brazenly, but most unnerving of all is the quasi-religious atmosphere that pervades. Italy is a country where processions like this happen every year in every village, but they usually take place in honour of the Madonna or of a local saint. Today they're taking place in honour of a man that the most of the world considers a monster. These people are making a pilgrimage not to the tomb of a Catholic saint or an apostle, but to that of a fascist dictator. When the procession arrives in the cemetery, Eda Negri Mussolini stands on the steps to make a short speech. "We are here to commemorate my grandfather," she says, "to pay our respects to this sacred place. It is not entirely clear that she regards this place as sacred because it isn't attached to the church, or because Mussolini is buried here. If the Yasukuni shrine is guilty of blurring the line between the guilty and the innocent, the shrine to Mussolini, and we'll talk about the Yasukuni shrine another time, but the shrine to Mussolini blurs nothing. It is abundantly clear what this place represents, and there is no apology about it. Mussolini did not spring from nowhere," writes Keith Lowe. "In the early 1920s, he was just one of many people promising to bring an end to months of turmoil and civil unrest that had followed the First World War. The difference between Mussolini and the most of his rivals was that he was not afraid to use violence to achieve his aims. His followers broke up strikes and demonstrations and mercilessly hunted down communist leaders and trade union representatives. Such methods proved so effective that he quickly won a great deal of support from business owners, military leaders, and Italian aristocrats. Unfortunately, Mussolini did not stop with breaking workers' strikes. In October 1922, 30,000 of his followers marched on Rome and demanded the resignation of the Prime Minister. Fearing further violence, the king simply handed power to Mussolini. In the following years, he and his followers used this power to terrorise political rivals, assassinate those who stood in his way, remove the rights of people who chose any other leader, and set up a police state. Mussolini provided a template for other fascist dictators like Hitler and Franco. Among his other faults, therefore, he is guilty of paving the way for years of ethnic cleansing, political violence, and eventually a world war. Mussolini repeatedly stated that his aim was to return Italy to its ancient imperial splendour through war and conquest. In 1923, he invaded Corfu and refused to withdraw his troops until Greece paid a ransom. In 1935, he invaded Abyssinia and gave his commanders written instructions to use poison gas on civilian populations, kill all prisoners, and systematically conduct a politics of terror and extermination on the rebels and the complicit population, all of which were war crimes, even at the time. In 1937, he sent thousands of troops to Spain to terrorise Valencia and Barcelona for Franco. In 1939, he invaded Albania, and in 1940, he tried to invade Greece and Egypt. All this was done in complete independence of Hitler. His support for Nazi Germany in its even more murderous campaigns was merely the icing on the cake. There are dozens of myths about Mussolini that survive to this day. The first is that he was not racist, on the grounds that his regime did not pursue Jews in the same way that the Nazis did. Anyone who has studied the ethnic cleansing of Libya in the 1920s and 30s might take issue with that. Mussolini himself instructed the governor of Libya, Pietro Badoglio, to make intermarriage between Italians and Libyans a crime, for fear that the Italian race might become polluted with foreign blood. Though he repeatedly claimed he bore no ill will to Jews or Muslims, his actions speak louder than words. In 1938, while he was at the height of his powers, Mussolini introduced racial laws into Italy that closely mirrored the Nazi Nuremberg laws, removing citizenship from Italian Jews and creating the circumstances by which the mass deportation of Jews was eminently more possible during the war years. There's a great deal of nonsense spoken about the supposed kind of improvements that Mussolini brought about through Italian fascism. The kind of the contradictory nature of Mussolini's policies, the attempts to kind of bring about a sort of natalist policy during a time in which food supplies were fixed, if not slightly declining, and the attempt to try to transform the land to create more agrarian kinds of agriculture in a land where kind of alpine farming and farming for produce like olives had always been the natural kind of agriculture. The rhetoric of fascism repeatedly met with cold, hard, economic and ethnographic realities. Mussolini's regime was intensely brutal. There is this idea, again, propagated by onlookers and sympathizers, that whatever Mussolini was, he was no Hitler. This is certainly true, but the Italian Social Republic, the Salo Republic, was an intensely brutal regime. Also, Italy's colonial undertakings in Abyssinia and Libya were again intensely brutal, and in some instances could arguably have been called genocidal. Italy's decision to help, or Mussolini's decision to help Franco in Spain, if one reads Paul Preston's The Spanish Holocaust, the consequences of that are staggering in terms of the death of the Spanish Republicans and others, and finally the decision to assist Hitler in his invasion of the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa places Mussolini in direct kind of culpability for the deaths of tens of millions of Russians. So this was not a kind of a sort of charming, bumbling fascist regime, and there's a sort of a particular kind of Anglo-centric sort of anti-Italian chauvinism that presents kind of Italy as this sort of rather incompetent sidekick to Hitler. Well, there is some truth in that, but the kind of the corollary of that is that it negates Mussolini's crimes, which were significant. The end of Mussolini was brought about by the war itself. Keith Lowe writes, "It was the Second World War that caused Mussolini's downfall, As defeat followed defeat in the middle of the war, his popularity amongst his own people began to wane. By 1943, even his own government were getting tired of him. In July that year, the Grand Council voted to strip him of his dictatorial powers. He was arrested and held in the luxury resort of in Abruzzo, while his successor, Pietro Badoglio, made peace overtures to the Allies. Mussolini was famously rescued that autumn, not by his own people, but by German special forces. It was the Germans who set him up as their puppet leader in the north of the country. Italy's far-right nationalists chose to forget this fact. Between 1943 and 1945, Mussolini did not fight for Italy, but for Germany. And the purposes of having having Mussolini as a puppet dictator in the north was simply to create a buffer zone against advancing Allied armies between Italy and southern Austria. Keith Lowe writes, Now at last, the viciousness that Mussolini had sanctioned against Ethiopians and Libyans was turned upon his own people. With German help, he organised the executions of some of the government members who had turned on him, including his own son-in-law, Count Ciano. With German help, his followers brutally suppressed any hint of resistance among the Italian population. Many of the portraits displayed in Bologna's Piazza del Nettuno are of people tortured and executed not by Germans, but by their fellow Italians. Some of the most notorious German atrocities were carried out with enthusiastic Italian collaboration. In Santa Anna di Stasesma, for example, around 560 villagers were massacred in reprisal for resistance activity in the area. The victims included old people, pregnant women, and around 100 children. It was the German SS who were responsible, but they were helped by the Italian 36th Black Brigade. It's worth noting that each Black Brigade was named after a prominent fascist leader. The particular unit bore the name Benito Mussolini. This is the man who is honoured 3 times a year with processions in Predappio. The cruelty that gripped northern Italy in the last 2 years of the war was a direct consequence of his ultra-nationalist ideology, his glorification of brute force, and his utter disregard for the rule of law. Qualities celebrated every time one of his modern-day disciples laid a wreath at his tomb. I think that modern-day right-wing populism, whilst it can be argued as being distinct from fascism, there are certain kind of aspects of it that are perhaps not quite the same, certainly celebrates the kind of the qualities of illegality, the idea that rules are simply things put there to constrain the actions of great men, and the principles of radical dynamism, action without much deliberation, and the kind of the visionary skill of the strongman, and also to some extent the glorification of brute force directed against our enemies and directed against those who have trespassed against us, those who we have been too soft on in the past. Fascism, and to a degree right-wing populism, conjure up ideas of justice and judgment and vengeance, and sort of some eternal defence of kind of a sacred idea of the nation. Mussolini, writes Keith Lowe, I beg your pardon, Keith. Mussolini, writes Keith Lowe, eventually reaped what he had sown. In the spring of 1945, German control over northern Italy collapsed under Allied pressure, and widespread insurrection against fascist rule broke out. Mussolini was captured by partisans as he tried to flee the country. He and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were executed by the side of the road, and their bodies were taken back to Milan and dumped in the Piazza Loreto, a site deliberately chosen because 15 partisans had been executed here by fascists the previous year. The bodies soon attracted a large crowd, some of whom exercised their disgust by kicking and beating them. One woman tried to shove a dead mouse in Mussolini's mouth. Others put a hunk of cheap, low-grade black bread in his hands, as if to say he was now as poor and contemptible as he had made them. Another woman reportedly fired a gun into his body several times, one for each of her dead sons. In the end, it was the partisans themselves who stepped in to spare the bodies further indignity. To carry on displaying them to the crowd as proof that their fascist leader was indeed dead, the bodies were suspended by their feet from the roof of a petrol station. Clara Petacci's skirt was tied around her legs to preserve her modesty. Photographs were taken and appeared in newspapers all over the country. What happened next is both bizarre and quite gruesome. Mussolini was buried in an unmarked grave in a Milanese cemetery, but about a year later was dug up by a journalist named Domenico Lucchesi and two other former fascists. For several months his body was moved from place to place, before the authorities finally traced it to a monastery outside Pavia, where it had been concealed by two Franciscan monks. Had the body been cremated or disposed of at sea, then perhaps it may have been the end of the matter, but instead the authorities dithered. For over 10 years the body was hidden at another monastery in the small town of Cerro Maggiore, while a succession of governments tried to work out what to do with it. Eventually, in 1957, a newly appointed Prime Minister, Oddone Zoli, agreed to give the body back to the Mussolini family to allow it to be interred in the family crypt at Predappio. It's probably no coincidence that the minority Christian Democrat government led by Zoli was embarrassingly dependent on neo-fascist votes. I've written and talked a lot about the resurgence of Italian neo-fascism after the war. You can find it on many previous podcast episodes. Mussolini was finally reinterred on the 1st of September 1957 in a stone sarcophagus decorated with fascist symbols. Above the sarcophagus, a larger-than-life white marble bust of Mussolini sits in the alcove, with a carved stone fasces on either side. The whole space is lit from above, as if the light of God is shining down upon him. In the years since, the town of Predappio has become something of a pilgrimage site for neo-fascists the world over. The house where Mussolini was born has long been a tourist destination. In the centre of the town are souvenir shops, which sell everything from t-shirts and keyrings with fascist slogans on them to swastika flags and life-size busts of Il Duce himself. Contrast that with Germany, where most of that would be a criminal offence, where there is certainly no shrine to Hitler. There are certainly no tourist shops handing out copies of or selling copies of Mein Kampf for Nazi armbands or anything like that, and look at how radically different the two cultures of memorialization and forgetting are, and it's quite extraordinary. And yet, actually, probably Germany is the outlier. If you go to countless countries where dictators and strongmen have been, their legacy lives on, from taxi drivers with pictures of Stalin in Moscow to now the kind of the partial rehabilitation of Mao in China. So actually the way in which Mussolini is venerated, because his physical remains can be still located somewhere, makes an unfortunate and kind of macabre logic. But it shows us that fascism, contrary to what many of us thought, feel, believe and expect, lingered on long after the end of the Second World War, and of course is still with us today. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and you can check out the learning resources at www.explaininghistory.org, and I'll be back on Wednesday with some extraordinary interviewing for you, and we'll leave it there. Take good care, everybody. All the best. Thanks. Bye-bye.